The case of the twin deception. The courtroom was silent, thick with anticipation. All eyes were on the prosecution's lawyer, who smirked as he presented what he believed to be irrefutable evidence. The grainy footage flickered on the screen. Jane, a woman supposedly bedridden and incapable of working, was seen mowing her lawn, unloading groceries, even jogging. The opposing attorney leaned forward, eyes gleaming with triumph. It was an open and shut case, or so they thought. Jane's attorney remained unshaken, waiting for their moment. When it finally arrived, they uttered just one sentence. "We call Jane's identical twin sister to the stand." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A woman, a perfect mirror of Jane, rose from her seat and walked confidently to the stand. Murmurs filled the room as realization dawned. The prosecution's footage, their airtight evidence, was meaningless. The woman in the video wasn't Jane, it was her sister, caring for her bedridden twin. The opposing attorney's face drained of color. The private investigator they had hired had failed to catch the simplest of details. The judge ruled in Jane's favor, awarding her full benefits. Justice had been served, but the look of humiliation on the prosecution's faces? That was the real victory. Part 2, The Vineyard Conspiracy. The sprawling vineyard was the pride of my grandfather, an empire he had built with years of sweat and sacrifice. So when two former employees claimed to have suffered debilitating back injuries while working for him, demanding exorbitant compensation, my grandfather knew something was off. Instead of surrendering to their demands, he hired a private investigator. What the PI uncovered was more than just fraud, it was an elaborate deception. Hidden cameras, long-lens photography, and weeks of surveillance painted a damning picture. These supposed victims weren't nursing their injuries. They were working at a lumber yard, lifting logs, operating heavy machinery, engaging in grueling physical labor, tasks far more demanding than anything at the vineyard. The evidence was undeniable. When presented in court, the two men had no defense. Their scam crumbled and my grandfather walked away victorious. It had cost him to hire the PI, but it was a fraction of what he would have lost to deception. Justice wasn't just served, it was harvested. Part 3, The Shadow in the Gym. She always had her suspicions. It started as a nagging feeling, an unexplained absence, a lingering doubt that grew until she could no longer ignore it. My wife needed answers and she wasn't going to get them from me, so she hired a private investigator to track my every move. But what she found wasn't an affair. What she found was nothing. Every morning after my graveyard shift, I followed the same routine. Gym, breakfast, Blockbuster, and maybe a trip to the pet store. A life as predictable as clockwork. But one day I noticed something strange. Someone was watching me. At first it was subtle. A man in the background appearing where I went. But soon it became obvious. He followed me to the gym, to breakfast, even to the video store. So I set a trap. With a friend's help, I cornered him in a pet store, demanding to know why he was following me. His response? "It's just a job." I called my wife immediately. She had spent money chasing ghosts, only to discover her biggest fear wasn't infidelity, it was how utterly boring I was. Years later we still laugh about it. But back then, in that moment, it felt like something out of a thriller. And the irony? I had been the one being hunted. Part 4, The Vanishing Brother. A desperate man approached me one evening, his eyes hollow with worry. His brother had disappeared, vanished into thin air, leaving behind a wife, children, and nothing but questions. He wouldn't just leave, he insisted. Something happened to him. He handed me an old, password-protected Windows XP desktop, the last thing his brother had touched before vanishing. Cracking the password was easy. Finding clues? Not so much. The browser history was wiped. His files were empty. No bank transactions, no messages, no trace of him anywhere. But then I saw it, an installation folder for World of Warcraft. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I opened the game, searched through his screenshots, and there it was. A series of images geotagged to an obscure internet cafe in another city. The chase had begun. Part 5, The Hidden Truth. The internet cafe was a shadowy hole in the wall, buzzing with the soft hum of computers and the quiet clatter of keyboards. I approached the manager, showing him a picture of the missing man. He hesitated before nodding. Yeah, he was here. Stayed for weeks. Never spoke much, just played the game. Then one day he left. I pressed for more details, but all the manager could offer was a time and a date, the last recorded login. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I relayed the information back to the family. They were relieved, but confusion clouded their relief. Why had he left everything behind? What had he been running from? Then, as if unlocking a final puzzle piece, the wife spoke. He was obsessed with someone in the game. He always talked about meeting them. He said they understood him more than anyone. It wasn't a disappearance, it was an escape. An escape into a digital world where he felt more seen, more alive than in his own home. When he was finally found, living under a new name, his words were simple but chilling. I wasn't missing. I just didn't want to be found. Some secrets aren't about what's hidden. They're about what people refuse to see. The vineyard stretched endlessly under the golden sun, rows of grapevines swaying gently in the breeze. My grandfather had built this estate from the ground up, dedicating his life to nurturing the land and growing the finest wines. His workers were like family and he prided himself on treating them well. But even in paradise, snakes slithered in the grass. It started with a letter, an official notice from a lawyer representing 2 former employees. The accusations were staggering. Both men claimed to have suffered debilitating back injuries while working in the vineyard, injuries so severe they could no longer work. They demanded not just medical expenses but a lifelong payout for their permanent disabilities. My grandfather, though a man of patience, had an uncanny instinct for deceit. Something about their claims didn't sit right with him. These weren't old, frail workers. They were in their prime, men who had worked without complaints for years. How had they suddenly become so gravely injured? And why had no one noticed anything before they left? Instead of immediately settling the claim, he took an unconventional route. He hired a private investigator. The PI was a quiet, unassuming man, the kind you wouldn't look at twice in a crowded room. But he had one specialty: uncovering lies. For weeks, he followed the 2 men, documenting their every move, waiting for a slip-up. He trailed them through the city, observed their routines, watched as they went about their disabled lives. What he found was shocking. These men weren't suffering, they were thriving. Every morning they drove to a lumber yard on the outskirts of town, where they worked long shifts handling logs, operating heavy machinery, and lifting weights that would cripple someone with a true back injury. The PI took photos and videos, capturing every incriminating detail. The way they tossed thick beams onto trucks, how they hoisted equipment without hesitation. It was all recorded. The investigator even managed to record one of the men laughing with a coworker, boasting about how they had played the old man for a fool, and how they were going to be set for life. They had no idea someone was watching. Armed with undeniable evidence, my grandfather's lawyer filed a counterclaim, bringing the case to court. The 2 men arrived confidently, expecting to walk away with a fortune. Their lawyer painted a picture of agony and struggle, telling the jury how these hard-working men had been reduced to shells of their former selves, unable to lift their own children, much less work. Then my grandfather's lawyer stood up and pressed play. The courtroom fell silent as the footage played on the large screen. There they were, the supposed victims, tossing 100-pound logs onto a truck like they were weightless. The jury watched as they moved swiftly, powerfully, without the slightest hesitation. Gasps filled the room. The judge's expression darkened. The 2 men, once so smug, suddenly looked like ghosts of themselves. Their lawyer fumbled for words, desperately trying to object, but the evidence was irrefutable. Not only was their case dismissed in record time, but they were immediately investigated for fraud. The insurance companies, furious at being deceived, pursued them legally. They didn't just lose their fake case, they lost everything. My grandfather didn't celebrate. He wasn't the type. He simply nodded as if he had known the outcome all along. The vineyard remained his, untainted by deception, a testament to hard work and integrity. And as for the 2 scammers? Let's just say that instead of sipping fine wine on ill-gotten earnings, they found themselves in a far less luxurious position, behind bars with plenty of time to reflect on their mistakes. Justice wasn't just served, it was uncorked. The feeling started as a whisper, a faint sensation that something wasn't right. A shadow at the edge of my vision, a flicker of movement when I turned my head. At first I ignored it. I wasn't the kind of man who jumped at ghosts. But ghosts don't follow you to the gym. My routine was simple, predictable even. I worked the night shift and got off at 7 a.m. Since most places weren't open yet, I'd hit the gym, grab breakfast, stop by Blockbuster, maybe visit a pet store before heading home. My wife worked early shifts, so our mornings never overlapped. That's when the suspicions crept in. She had always been the jealous type, not in an obsessive way but enough that she questioned things. And in a relationship where cultural differences already made trust a challenge, it didn't take much for doubt to fester. She wanted to believe me, but in the end, she didn't trust her own heart. So she hired someone to find the truth. It didn't take me long to notice him. The first time he was a blur in the background, just another guy at the gym. But then I saw him again at breakfast, and again at Blockbuster, and again when I stopped by the pet store to grab food for our birds and fish. Coincidence? Maybe once, but not 4 times in a row. Curiosity turned to paranoia. Was I in trouble? Had I done something to attract the wrong kind of attention? I told my gym buddy about it and we hatched a plan. The next day I mentioned, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, that I was heading to a specific pet store after my workout. If my stalker left the gym right after me, my friend would follow. Sure enough, the moment I stepped out, my shadow moved too. I pulled into the pet store parking lot, my heart pounding harder than it had on the treadmill. I walked in, pretending to browse the shelves, waiting. A minute later, he entered. And a minute after that, my friend walked in too. The air grew heavy as we closed in on him, cornering him near the fish tanks. He looked startled, his eyes darting between us. "Why are you following me?" I demanded. He hesitated, shifting on his feet. "It's just a job." "A job doing what?" my buddy asked, stepping closer. The man sighed, realizing he was caught. "Look, I wasn't going to do anything. Just watching. That's it." "Watching for who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He wouldn't say, but he didn't have to. I let him go, but not before warning him to stay away from my gym and to find another hobby. Then I went home and called my wife. She answered casually, but I could hear the tension in her voice. "Hey, what's up?" "You're wasting your money," I said flatly. There was silence on the other end. Then she sighed. "So, you saw him?" "Yeah. And he sucks at his job." Another pause. "He didn't see anything, did he?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Unless you count me renting the same movie twice and feeding the fish, no." A soft chuckle from her end. And just like that, the wall between us cracked. She had spent all that money hoping to uncover some hidden secret, only to find out that I was the most boring man alive. "Guess I should have just asked," she admitted. "Yeah, you should have." After that, the jealousy faded, the trust deepened, and we moved forward. Maybe it wasn't the fairy tale ending some would hope for, but after 25 years together, I think we did just fine. And for the record, I never saw that PI again. But I like to think that somewhere out there, he's still shaking his head at the easiest paycheck he ever earned. It started with a knock on my door. A relative of a friend stood there, his face lined with worry, his hands clenched into fists. "I need your help," he said. I wasn't a detective. I wasn't even in law enforcement. But I knew my way around computers, and that's exactly why he had come to me. His brother, let's call him Daniel, had vanished. No warnings, no goodbyes. He had walked out of his home one evening and never returned, leaving behind a wife and 2 small children who had no idea where he had gone. They weren't separated. There had been no fights, no heated arguments. One day he was there. The next he was gone. The police had written it off as voluntary disappearance, suggesting he had abandoned his responsibilities. But his family knew better. Something wasn't right. Desperate for answers, they had brought me Daniel's desktop computer, an old Windows XP machine. "We don't know his passwords," his brother admitted, "but maybe you can find something. An email, a message, anything." It took me less than an hour to crack his password. But once inside I found nothing. No emails. No browser history. No saved documents. It was almost as if Daniel had wiped everything before he left. Almost. Then I found something. Buried deep in his hard drive was one overlooked detail, a World of Warcraft installation. Most people wouldn't think twice about it. But I knew online games had chat logs, saved screenshots, and even location data from where a player last logged in. I opened the folder. And that's when I found them, the screenshots. Hundreds of them taken automatically by the game. Most were unremarkable, images of Daniel's character standing in cities, dungeons, or battlefields. But a few were different. One showed a private chat window mid-conversation. The text was small, barely readable, but I zoomed in. "Everything's set. Meet me tomorrow at the usual spot." "Are you sure?" "No turning back after this." "I'm sure. I can't stay here. It's time." My pulse quickened. The timestamp was from the night before he disappeared. Then I found another. A real-life photograph. Not from the game, but a personal picture hidden among the files. It was blurry, taken from a phone, but I could make out the details. A bus station. A one-way ticket on the bench beside him. A duffel bag at his feet. And Daniel, staring at the camera with an expression that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It was relief. He had left willingly. But why? And who was he meeting? I traced the location of the bus station, using the ticket details to estimate his destination. He hadn't gone far, just to the next city over. His family was shocked. They had expected foul play, not this. His brother went to find him. A few days later I got a call. "We found him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's okay. He couldn't handle it anymore." Turns out, Daniel hadn't been running from danger. He had been running from himself. The pressures of family life, the expectations, the quiet desperation of feeling trapped in a routine he no longer wanted, he had reached his breaking point. And instead of confronting it, he had walked away. I wish I could say it had a happy ending. That he went back and everything was fine. But life doesn't work that way. Some wounds take longer to heal. Some never do. But at least now his family had answers. And sometimes that's the only closure you get. Some stories don't end with a courtroom revelation or a thrilling chase. Some end in whispers, in quiet moments of realization that change everything. This was one of those stories. It began when a woman named Laura walked into a private investigator's office, her hands shaking as she placed a stack of cash on the desk. "I need you to find out the truth," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The PI, a seasoned detective named Carter, leaned forward. "What kind of truth?" "My father," Laura said, her eyes darting to the door as if afraid someone might be listening. I think he's not who he says he is." Carter had heard it all before. Affairs, secret families, hidden debts. But there was something about the way Laura spoke, the absolute fear in her voice, that made him take the case. Her father, Richard, was a respected businessman. Wealthy, well-connected, the kind of man people admired. But Laura had always felt something was off. Little things. The way he refused to talk about his past. The way he flinched at certain names on the news. The way he always avoided being photographed. Carter dug into Richard's history, starting with the basics. Birth certificates, employment records, financial transactions. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But then, an inconsistency. Richard's social security number was issued years after he was supposedly born. His birth certificate? A forgery. His earliest financial records? A dead end. Whoever Richard was, he hadn't existed before a certain point in time. Carter widened his search. He combed through old missing persons reports, crime records, anything that could match a man who had seemingly created a new identity out of thin air. And then he found it. An old, grainy newspaper clipping from nearly 40 years ago. A bank robbery gone wrong. A shootout. 3 dead, 1 missing. The missing man? A young accomplice named Jonathan Pierce. A man who, years later, looked exactly like Richard. Carter's blood ran cold as he pieced it together. Richard wasn't just hiding a past, he was a fugitive. He had walked away from a crime scene, abandoned his old name, and built a new life from scratch. And for decades he had lived in plain sight, a ghost wearing another man's skin. Laura met Carter in a dimly lit cafe, her fingers gripping a cup of untouched coffee. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice tight. Carter hesitated. "Are you sure you want to know?" Her knuckles whitened. "I paid you to find the truth." So he told her. Every detail. Every lie. Every secret buried in the past. Tears welled in Laura's eyes. "All these years. I thought he was just a private man. But he wasn't. He was hiding." Carter nodded. "What you do with this information is up to you. But if you go to the police, you have to be ready for what comes next." Laura sat in silence for a long time, staring into the abyss of her own shattered reality. Then she stood up, sliding an envelope across the table. "This is the rest of your payment. I don't need any more details." "Are you going to tell him?" Carter asked. Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. "No. Some ghosts are best left alone." And just like that she walked away. Carter never heard from her again. He followed the news, waiting for the day Richard's past would catch up to him. But it never did. Laura had made her choice. Some betrayals don't end in handcuffs. Some end in silence. And sometimes silence is the cruelest punishment of all. Every person who hires a private investigator seeks one thing: truth. But as we've seen, truth is not always black and white. It can be shocking, heartbreaking, or even liberating. From a courtroom twist that turned the tables, to a vineyard owner exposing fraud, to a husband proving his innocence, to a missing man running from his own life, and finally, a daughter uncovering a father's deepest secret. Each story holds a lesson. Truth has power. But sometimes knowing it changes everything. So, what would you do if you uncovered a secret that could alter your world forever? Would you expose it? Or would you keep it buried? If any of these stories resonated with you, let us know in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a shocking revelation? We'd love to hear your story. And if you enjoyed this thrilling journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more suspenseful stories and real-life mysteries. Who knows? The next story might just be yours.